Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
In what would be his final speech, American civil rights icon Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave these sobering words. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. It's almost as if he knew he would meet his end soon after, but felt compelled perhaps by an unshakable courage to leave his people with a sense of optimism going forward. With the odds against him, he had the courage to believe that equality would one day be achieved in America. Thank you for joining us for Ethical Perspectives on the News. I'm your moderator, Stacey Walker. Today, we'll be talking about political courage. Our panelists will share with us what they believe it means and why it's important during these most challenging times. Our panel includes esteemed writer, columnist, and resident expert on libertarian politics, Adam Sullivan. We also have with us Provost, Dean of Faculty and Political Scientist at Coe College, Dr. Paula O'Loughlin. And last but not least, we have with us J.D. Scholten, former candidate for Congress in Iowa's 4th Congressional District and thought leader in American politics. To open the program, I'll begin with the question, what does political courage mean to you? What does it look like? And Adam, we'll start with you.
When I think maybe a lot of people to this question would think about politicians or people they think of statesmen, but I don't think it's quite right to think of political leaders, people in elected office as being courageous. I think we really ought to look to activists, to the grassroots as being courageous. Those are the people who take real risks when they enter the political arena. By and large, people who are in elected office already, if they get thrown out of elected office because they took an unpopular position, they're going to be fine. They're not going to be destitute. But it's actually people who engage in electoral politics and activism and issue advocacy at the grassroots level who are really being courageous. And so the people who defy the status quo, the people who take positions that might make it difficult for them to go about their social lives and their professional lives, those are the people that I really think of as politically courageous.
Thank you for that. Our resident political scientist on the panel, Dr. Paula O'Loughlin, what's your take on what it means to have political courage?
To me, it's speaking truth to power, whatever the consequences, based on your personal beliefs. The difference, in my opinion, is that it can include activists and those inside institutions.
All right. And JD, you're just rolling off a congressional campaign in Iowa's 4th district. Tell us what that means to you to have political courage.
I think it is standing up to the status quo. It's so easy to just do the same old, or do what we did previously or kick the can down the road. And what we see is when you do something different and you do it well, you get noticed. But I think there's a lot of opportunity, regardless if you're an activist or a candidate or a politician, to really do something different and challenging. And if you challenge the powers that be in the right way, I think that people will start following you. And I think that's what we've seen in certain movements, whether it's what you mentioned about Dr. King or someone like my political heroes, the Paul Wellstones, the Berkeley Bedells, the Tom Harkins.
Excellent. I want to stay with you on this because you've run 2 impressive congressional campaigns in Western Iowa. You've been considered the most successful Democrat in recent years in a traditionally red part of the state. What surprised many political insiders was how you were able to get so much traction in a conservative district running on what many people would describe as a progressive platform. So talk to us about that. I mean, does it take some courage to do what you did 2 times in a row now?
I don't know if it takes courage, but I don't know if this was the smartest or dumbest thing I've ever done, and I still think it's yet to be determined. For me and what I wanted to do was I had a clear vision of what I wanted to accomplish. When we first ran in the 2018 cycle against Congressman King, we could have easily just done what most Democrats would want to do, just bash him and that would be about it. But I wanted to get out there to the people, and so I made a commitment of getting out there, buying our campaign RV and just really being nonstop. And we took that into this election cycle, and not just be against the other person or anything like that. It's standing for something. And I think people really caught on to that and really felt that just what we started with very grassroots, partly because we had to. No one recruited me to run. I didn't know a lot of things early on, but I knew what I wanted to do, and I knew eventually we would get there. And so I think a lot of people appreciated the work ethic, appreciated the authenticity, appreciated something different in a campaign. And we just continued to grow and grow. And unfortunately, we didn't win, but I still think that what we were able to do will be a playbook for other folks in the future.
So I thank you for that. I want to go back to Adam. Adam, I know you said, when you think of courage, you think of people sort of outside the institution of electoral politics. But, in looking, I know that you're an observer of politics. I know that's part of what you do as a columnist. JD just said he feels like he kind of left a playbook for folks when you run for office. In my perspective, it does take a little bit of courage to say, we are going to run a campaign only about what we believe in, and we're not going to worry about the polls, and we're going to try to get people to buy into this platform. So, is that a playbook that you have seen across the state, or do you have any examples of folks inside the institution of politics exercising that kind of courage, or even outside the institution of politics?
Sure. I don't want to say politicians are all bad, and I don't want to say that politicians can't be courageous, but I guess my focus is on people who are outside of institutions of elective office, because I think that's more interesting. I think those are people who aren't getting the attention that they deserve in all cases. And so I think if you look at this past year with the Black Lives Matter movement that's happened in Iowa, in Cedar Rapids, you have Advocates for Social Justice, which Stacey, you've been involved with, and in Iowa City, you have the Iowa Freedom Riders. Des Moines has the Des Moines Black Lives Matter movement. And I think that those people are, if we want to talk about political courage in 2020, those are the folks that I would talk about, folks that risked, and actually in some cases were arrested for the political positions that they took.
In some cases, physically harmed with chemical agents being deployed on some of the early protesters.
Right, exactly. And so I talked with one young man in Des Moines, Jalen Cavill, who he actually ran a write-in campaign for sheriff, and he formerly worked with Democratic candidates. Just as recently as the Senate primary from this year, he was working for Democratic candidates, and he came out and said, no, I'm not excited about the Democrat who's running for sheriff. I'm not really excited about Democrats who are running for federal office. And so I'm going to put my name in the ring and run a campaign. Now, obviously, he understood he wasn't going to become sheriff and he wasn't going to be an elected official, but he was willing to put his hat in the political ring and made all those risks that we've been talking about. And so certainly I have appreciation for people who run the right kind of campaigns. And certainly that goes for you, Supervisor Walker. That goes for you, JD. 100% appreciate that. But I have to give credit to the people in the streets, because once people are elected, how do we hold them accountable? One way to hold them accountable is at the ballot box, but another way is through direct action. And I think you've seen the legislature passed a historic police reform bill. Iowa City, Cedar Rapids are taking it on pretty seriously. That doesn't happen unless there's people in the streets going to elected officials' houses, going to meetings, doing all those kinds of things. That's where political courage, really where the rubber meets the road for me.
You will find no disagreement for me. JD, or we'll go to first.
Okay.
Paula,
I was going to ask Adam a follow-up question, if that's okay. Adam, it strikes me that part of what you're talking about with political courage here is not so much the focus on the great individual, but the focus on setting an agenda. And I think that's what people often forget about in terms of what takes courage. The courage is to keep talking and to keep pushing it when you may never get any results, or you may not get results until you're further along. So that piece feels like the real part is the part of courage we don't talk about is the agenda setting power of those who are without power in a situation.
Absolutely. And it's been fascinating this year as now that police reform and racial justice are really finally on the agenda. There's actually all these ideas we can point to and policies that have been advocated for years because this work's been going on. That the activists have been pushing this agenda for 20 years, and now it's on the mainstream map. So I think that's absolutely true when you say agenda setting, that it takes many years and many people, many movements to put something on the agenda to where mainstream government will really consider it.
JD, you had a comment?
Well, I just wanted to kind of echo in saying I don't always get to hear what's on the other side of the state. And so in this district, in the 4th Congressional District, we had over 17, I believe, different communities have Black Lives Matter event. And just think of how drastically different that is from who our congressman has been the last 18 years. And so for me, if you want to talk about political courage with the Black Lives Matter movement, I think what has happened, especially in rural communities, I think has been, that's really stepping outside of your box, and I think they need to be commended as well.
Well, it's really interesting to me out of this, because when we're having this conversation, we're having this huge national conversation right now about the lack of courage of some people to speak against the majority, and yet we're maybe having the biggest conversation about political courage in terms of our national agenda that we've had in Iowa too, I would say, in terms of the courage to stand against entrenched interests related to the pandemic than we've had in a long time, at least probably since the McCarthy era.
So I want to follow up, and I'll ask our panelists this question generally. Do you feel that there is a lack of political courage within political institutions? And JD, why don't you let us know how you feel about that?
Absolutely. Though, if you look at how federal races are run and everything, and at least my perspective from the Democratic Party is that the system doesn't allow for it. You have you're told by the DCCC, if you're a competitive race, that you have to do X, Y, and Z in order for you to get support. And once you get the support, and part of the process is you have to hire consultants that they are comfortable with. And so the whole system is meant for your messaging, everything about you is to be what they're comfortable with. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's one thing that we stood out we didn't have that initially, and then once we proved ourselves to be a worthy candidate or a worthy race, then we were having these arguments, and we ended up rejecting the DCCC's help this election cycle. And so and then once you go there, if you need the DCCC's help for re-election, you have to follow all these guidelines, and so the room and the system is not meant for that. And the system is also not meant for working class people to run for office. It's all focused on fundraising. And I feel we're losing, that's part of the reason why, that's happening on both sides of the aisle, but it's part of the disingenuousness of politics, is that the system is meant for you to raise money, to give to consultants, to have a message that is poll tested, and it just really just disengages with a lot of people, and that's why so many people are tuned off in politics.
So you talk about the system. There needs to be structural changes that can allow even for our politicians running for office to be courageous, and how the system, the structural failures, if you will, of the system really sort of curtails the messaging in a lot of instances. And Paula, I know you've written about politicians giving cues to the electorate, and you've written about how cultural figures can give cues via messaging to an electorate, to a people. Is there more to be said about how politicians can use their platforms to advance ideas and issues even when they might not have the majority of the people's support, or even when they don't have the majority of the institution's support?
Well, I think, yeah, absolutely. I think we've been talking a little bit about this related to Black Lives Matter. There is no, on the national level, there is really no institutional support, and in the state, on the state level either in Iowa, for a lot of the demands of the Black Lives Matter movement. Yet we're sitting here talking on in a public affairs program about Black Lives Matter, and the idea of the trope of defund the police has become a powerful message for us in Iowa, but also nationally. So I think one of the ways you can affect things, both for those with expertise and those without political expertise, is by agenda setting, because then you force people to talk about what you want to talk about, and then you frame it appropriately. And when we frame things in terms of questions of justice or rights, as opposed to choices and things like that, you end up actuating a different part of people's brains, and that goes down another path. So I think the one thing to know is that the one piece I'll stop pontificating as a faculty member here, is that if we use powerful enough language, resonant cues, even those who are more politically expert about these issues are not able to hold back against them. So if we can figure out the cues that work, we can bring people together around issues. And I will think about an argument or a political debate, which hopefully is over with, but probably isn't, of 20 years ago about whether gay rights was equal rights or special rights. And that gay rights was equal rights became the thing. And GLBT is what we would say now, Q. But making it about equal rights, not special rights, and the same thing goes on in questions of affirmative action, equity in schools, etc., then you can actually not just set the agenda, but set the terms of the agenda. And so I do think there's ways in which you can show courage just by opening your mouth, even if you never get the chance to walk the halls of power.
I hear you. I appreciate you. And that was a great reference point for us. So Adam, I want to go to you now. You've heard JD, the candidate. You've heard a little bit about from the professor on all of this. And I appreciate you for bringing up right away the work of folks involved in Black liberation here in this state. I think it's obviously laudable work, and it's been an honor and privilege myself to be a part of that work too. Those are the folks you're holding up as people who are being courageous in politics, even if they're not formally inside of politics. From your vantage point, what is next? What is next for these movement activists?
I think it is crucial that they stay involved in the movement. So you're not going to be able, you can't sustain 1,000-person rallies in the streets for a very long time. So they're going to have to move to different kinds of advocacy. Part of that is going to be at the ballot box. Part of that is going to be within party politics. You're already seeing, especially again in Des Moines, they're showing a high interest in getting involved with electoral systems, it's local elections with the local Democratic Party. And that is all very important, but it's also going to take more direct action, which, in the big, kind of excitement of a mass protest movement, you can, like I said, you can turn thousands of people out. Months down the line, people's interest wanes. Unfortunately, that's the story of every movement. And so it's going to be tough to continue to stay engaged with local action. But I do continue to see people, going to their local city council meetings, whether, it's on Zoom right now and staying involved in that way, applying for commissions and things like that. So that's important. And then the other thing is, making the case to the general public. So as we saw in the last election, the idea of defund the police, it proved unpopular. It made a lot of people uncomfortable. But at the same time, those policy ideas that brought on, those are still moving forward. In some cases, those have already been codified. So I think you're always going to have radicals. You're always going to have people who are making people uncomfortable. And I think in a lot of cases, whatever issue you're talking about, whichever side of it you're on, that's probably necessary to push the envelope.
Excellent. JD, I want to go back to you. So we've heard Adam talk about what he thinks is next for those sort of grassroots activists. You talked about a lot of the structural problems with party politics, and both parties, major parties in American politics, kind of struggles with those same issues. What is next for party politics? How do we address some of those issues you brought up about the structural failure of how we do politics currently?
Well, I think the Democratic Party really needs to take a look in the mirror coming after this 2020 election. I think there's been a lot of articles recently. In fact, there's been 3 over the weekend and today about we can't look at what happened and just be satisfied. We've have a huge hurdle to continue to fight in rural America. And that's one area that I'm very passionate about. And this is something like the professor was talking about, how sometimes your words and what you can say can really influence beyond just one campaign. In 2018, and even early on this election cycle, I had a national article written about me saying I was the only person talking about antitrust in agriculture in the Stockyards and Packers Act. And not only did every Democratic presidential candidate have that on their rural policy plan, it's being talked about more and more now as they're looking for a Secretary of Agriculture. But then also there was articles talking about how do we reach out to rural America, and every one of those talked about antitrust. And this is something nobody was talking about a couple of years ago. And so I do think there is this power out there, in especially here in Iowa, when we have the caucus, and hopefully we continue to have it. But all these activists that got engaged, they have such a tremendous amount of opportunity and power that they need to understand. Every 4 years, we have so much power that they can influence and find ways to do that and stay active. I think that's one of the things that these younger folks that are starting to get active, maybe, and think entrepreneurially, maybe start a consultant firm or a digital content firm. And there's, I think, so much opportunity here in Iowa for young activists.
Agreed. So, Paula, I want to go back to you. You talked, sort of technically about how we frame literally the words we use and how that can benefit certain causes. We've heard throughout history, keep calm and carry on. We have nothing to fear but fear itself. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. How important is it that folks inside politics, formally politicians, folks outside of politics proper, these grassroots activists, how much of a focus do they need to put on the rhetoric of their passions?
So I think they need to pay a ton of attention to the rhetoric, and I don't think that rhetoric is simply a manifestation of political courage. Even though rhetoric allows us to sort of display it, I can mouth the words of the rhetoric, and yet if I am not facing odds or trying to change something, where's my courage? So that to me, and I may be different here, I mean, there's a lot about courage that's both political, but it's also a moral decision. I mean, there's a lot of courage going on in a lot of dimensions of our lives right now, and some of them are political or the lack thereof, and some of them are just moral social courage to disagree with others and to face the consequences. So
yeah, so what I heard you say in the beginning, it's not enough to talk about the things you want to do and to have courageous rhetoric. You've got to actually do something, which I think is an important point to underscore. So we only have a few minutes left. I want to let you all sort of react to the question about, what is your best sort of advice or insight to the grassroots activists, Adam, that you've talked a lot about today, or to the politicians, or to the party. And Adam, will start with you, and you can react to that question, or you can sort of talk generally about what you've seen. You're a columnist from one of the largest papers in the state, living in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, one of the largest cities in the state. You've seen a lot of politics at the local level. So you can give us your insights about courage interfacing with politics at the local level, or give us your best advice to the grassroots activists.
I want to go back to something. I think you asked another panelist earlier, what's an example of a lack of courage in our politics today? I'm a Republican, and I'm a strong believer that we need to, to some extent, stay in our own lanes and critique our own side, make sure our own house is in order. And so I spend a lot of time critiquing other Republicans. It's obvious, and I'd just be remiss if I didn't mention it tonight, that there's been an extreme lack of courage among Republicans in elected office and in the grassroots during the Trump era. The president has been totally in defiance of basic conservative and small government values for his whole presidency. And the Republican establishment and Republican voters have totally gone along with it for the most part. So I appreciate the handful of nationally recognized Republicans who have stood up to Trump. But what I'm really concerned about is that Republican voters created the conditions where Republican politicians could just exhibit total fealty to the president. And so you can blame the politicians, sure, but the real problem is that, Trump won the Iowa caucuses with 97% of the vote. So I think that shows extreme political cowardice, and I'm extremely concerned about it.
Thank you for that. Paula, we've got a couple minutes left.
Yeah, I would say to the activists, keep on keeping on, in the words of Paul Wellstone, because the results of political courage are often in another generation's arc of justice, and you just have to believe in where you're going. And to the folks in the institutions and to the folks in the parties, get some courage to both parties.
All right. And we'll let you close us out, JD. What final words do you have for us?
Well, the best advice I got in the 2018 cycle very early on was from a family friend who is a member of the Winnebago Nation across the river in South Sioux City, Nebraska. And he saw what I was trying to do, and he's been a longtime activist. And he told me, JD, if you want change, you have to get uncomfortable. And once you get uncomfortable, you have to get others uncomfortable. And I think that goes for anybody who's trying to show political courage or get active. And so it's been the thing that's been near and dear in my heart, and it's pushed me to where we're at today. So, and thank you very much for having me on. I'll say that as well.
It's been a pleasure to have you all. So what I heard from JD is sometimes we have to get uncomfortable. What I heard from Paula is to keep on keeping on. And what we heard from Adam in his final words were, folks just got to be better. It's up to all of us. And we got to hold people accountable in our own party and outside of our own party if we're ever going to sort of get through the morass of where we're at right now. I want to extend my thanks to all of you for joining for this conversation. Like most other conversations on this program, I feel like we could go for hours, but we only have a finite amount of time. So I want to extend my thanks to you and to also encourage you all in your respective fields in academia and news and media and JD and electoral politics and whatever it is you're going to do, to be encouraged, because it's these kind of voices that really need to be amplified if we're going to move the needle in a positive direction. So that is all the time we have today. It is my hope that these conversations inspire you all to be a little more active in our beloved community, and when necessary, exercise the courage we've talked so much about today during these challenging times. I'm your host, Stacey Walker, and we'll see you all next time on Ethical Perspectives on the News.